Okay, our next speaker is Ken Robeson. He's a native Montanan, historian at the Overholser Historical Research Center in Fort Benton, Great Falls Cascade County Historic Preservation Commission. He's author of Montana Territory in the Civil War, Frontier Forged on the Battlefield, Life and Death on the Upper Missouri, The Frontier Sketches of Johnny Healy, Cascade County and Great Falls, and Fort Benton. Ken is a retired Navy captain after a career in naval intelligence. The Montana Historical Society honored him as Montana Heritage Keeper in 2010. Ken Robeson.
Well, we've this all the way in the back. I guess you really have to hold it close. Can I switch to that other one? I don't want to swallow it. This is better? Yeah. I don't have to eat it to be heard. Well, when the conference set in 2014, in the midst of all these sesquicentennials, I thought it might be a useful context as we talk about the Mullan Road to bring the other really big factors that we're celebrating 150 anniversaries of into play. Of course, we're in the middle of the 4-year Civil War sesquicentennial, but as Ken Egan very nicely emphasized, we're also in the middle of the 150th anniversary of the formation of Montana Territory. And I think we do best to understand the context of all three of these events with the Mullan Road in 1860, the commencement of the Civil War 61, and the formation of the new territories on the upper Missouri and the northwest being Idaho, Dakota, and Montana territories, all formed in a rapid succession, accelerated by the discovery of gold, but driven by the Civil War and Lincoln's war policies. All these events are interwoven, and what I'd like to spend a few moments with you today is looking into how interwoven they really were. The remarkable summer of 1860 provided the prelude to all this. Discovery of gold on the Clearwater in then Washington Territory sparked a rush to the region. Fort Walla Walla was the hub. At that time, Washington Territory, shown in green, as I'm sure most of you know, was huge. Also huge was the Great White to the east that was still part of Nebraska Territory. East of the Continental Divide, Fort Benton was the hub. Steamboats arrived at the head of navigation for the first time in July 1860. These steamboats brought Major George A.H. Blake and his 300 First Dragoons to become the first and last, for that matter, military users of the wagon road. Shortly after their arrival, Captain William Reynolds and his Army Topographic Survey expedition, after spending the previous year in the Yellowstone Basin and then wintering in northern Wyoming, came down from the confluence of the Missouri River, arrived in Fort Benton also in July. And of course, the arrival of John Mullan on the 4th of August completed that 624-mile military wagon road building expedition. 9 months later, in April 1861, the Civil War erupted back in the States with profound effect throughout the continent. 1 month earlier, Dakota Territory had been created, encompassing today's Montana east of the Divide. When the Civil War began, the upper Missouri was a vast land of many cultures, as we heard from Julie. In addition to the thousands of Native Americans populating the dozen tribes spread through the area, a small number of Americans, Canadians, French, Métis, Spanish, and Mexicans were present, primarily involved in the fur and robe trade. As the Civil War began, at least two of Mullan's men from his military escort, the 3rd Artillery Regiment, resigned their commissions to join the Confederacy. First Lieutenant James Lyon White had commanded the 130-man Mullan military escort, while Second Lieutenant Harlan Benton Lyon served as quartermaster and commissary officer. Both officers were military academy classmates of Mullan, and now they joined the rebellion. Others of Mullan's men followed in the next year or so. And others from the upper Missouri region, like Henry Kennerly, who's shown seated on the right with 4 other of the early frontiersmen from the Fort Benton area. Henry Kennerly had come with that 1855 Treaty Council negotiation and had accompanied the senior commissioner, Thomas Cummin. After the conclusion of the Blackfoot Treaty, which involved other tribes as well, he headed down the Missouri River, and yet he came back and spent time between 1855 and 1861 in the what later became the Dakota Territories. Well, in 1861, he headed down to return to his home in Missouri to join 3 of his brothers in the 1st Missouri Infantry, fighting under General Sterling Price, leading the Missouri troops that were loyal to the Confederacy. With the May 10th, 1861 Camp Jackson affair at St. Louis, the Civil War erupted in that vital crossroads state of Missouri. Briefly, on the night of May 9th, Union Captain Nathaniel Lyon quietly moved his loyal German immigrant regiments from the St. Louis Arsenal to surround this area shown here, this Camp Jackson. At the time, the 700 Missouri State Guardsmen, with 5 senior officers, all loyal to the secession movement, and looking to work with Governor Claiborne Jackson of Missouri to bring Missouri into the Confederacy. Lyon moved his troops in overnight with overwhelming force, and the Missouri State Guardsmen surrendered. 3 of the Kennerly brothers were at that camp. All of those prisoners were treated as prisoners of war, even though technically there was no declared war, the Guardsmen had not formally joined the Confederacy, and yet they treated them like Confederate British prisoners. They were paroled, and one of the fascinating officers, Major Nick Wall, who was the major commissary at Camp Jackson with the Missouri State Guard, he was paroled to either remain in St. Louis for the duration of the war or to go to the Western Territories, and he opted for the latter. So when that famous Joe LaBarge steamboat Emily that had the Veils and was loaded with many others departed St. Louis that next spring in 1862, Nick Wall was on board as the clerk of the boat. Actually, his intention was to do that service for Captain LaBarge, and in exchange, when the Emily arrived at Fort Benton, Nick Wall would go ashore with a big supply of goods and head over to the mining camps. Now, it's important to understand when they left St. Louis in the spring of 1862, the miners on board and those passengers thought they were all going over to the Washington, Idaho area, Washington gold mines, because word had not gotten back to St. Louis at that point that Gold Creek colors had been struck, and by the time they got to Fort Benton and found that out, they used the Mullan Road to go on over to the Gold Creek area rather than continuing on to Idaho. The summer of 61, as the Civil War began with a vengeance on the Eastern and Western theaters, Captain Mullan, of course, continued his work. The following year, he completed his Mullan Road building when he arrived in Fort Benton on the 8th of June. That year of 1862 provided a sea change year on the upper Missouri with the gold strikes at Gold Creek. Shortly after, exciting strikes also occurred, of course, at Grasshopper Creek, and the stampede was on to the Montana placer mines. On the 8th of June, as I mentioned, Mullan returned for the final road building work to Fort Benton. 9 days later, the steamboats Emily and Shreveport arrived at the Fort Benton upper levee with 400 passengers. They were loaded to the gills and 600 tons of cargo. If you can imagine these 250 to 300 foot steamboats fighting their way up the Missouri River all the way from St. Louis to Fort Benton. It had to be a sight to behold. The gold rush was on, and of course the road they used was the Mullan Road. On board the Emily was Major Nick Wall, and his impact on Montana, although he's still very little known, was immense. Within 2 years, with Nick Wall operating in Montana and his partners in St. Louis, John J. Rowe and Captain John G. Copeland, Rowe's son-in-law, they had formed the most sophisticated integrated transportation system that was operating probably in the whole West at the time, because what they were doing with Copeland running the operation they were running the steamboats from St. Louis up to Fort Benton. With the cargo on board offloaded at Fort Benton, Wall was on the receiving end and had formed what later became the famed Diamond R Overland Freighting Company. Wall's wagons, the large number of wagons and men working for him, would take the goods over to the gold camps, and at the gold camps like Bannack and then in 63 Virginia City, John J. Rowe and Company retail stores would sell the goods. So you had all the way from St. Louis to selling the goods in the what was at that time in 63 Idaho Territory, a very integrated operation. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., during the spring of 1862, with the withdrawal of the southern states from the Union, President Lincoln's Republican Congress passed momentous legislation that would forever change the future of the western United States. In 3 amazing months, without Southern obstructionism, Congress passed the Homestead Act, opening millions of acres for future land settlement, the Pacific Railway Act, paving the way for the transcontinental railroads, the Morrell Land Grant College Act, of course, greatly broadening education, and I've got to add here, go Grizz. Sorry, Bobcats. There aren't many here, though. How many Bobcats are here? Yeah, there's a handful. Good. And of course, the fourth piece of very important legislation was the abolition of slavery in Washington, D.C. and the Western territories. In addition, the Civil War settled forever, of course, the two fundamental questions. There would be a unified United States, and there would no longer be slavery. The Civil War directly impacted every section, every community, every family, and every individual, and those that came west bore their wartime experiences, men, women, and children. The Civil War and the gold accelerated the settlement and formation of Idaho and Montana territories. The extracted gold and other mineral wealth helped to fill the coffers of the federal government, which of course was in need of wartime financing, directly aiding the war effort. The Lincoln government sought to add new territories as quickly as possible as prospective new loyal states, knowing that eventually the former states of the South would come back in, and the Republicans as well as Lincoln knew the more they had entered in the West, the better they'd be to balance a returning Southern senator and representative influx. And less than a year later, Congress was debating the admission of a new territory to represent the Bannack and Virginia City mining camps. This was in the winter leading into the spring of 1864. Idaho promoter J.L. Campbell proposed this monster Idaho Territory. However, led by the chairman of the Congressional Territories Committee, James M. Ashley, Montana Territory was named and created a couple weeks from now, 150 years ago, on the 26th of May, 1864. If you saw the great movie Lincoln this past year, you might remember that James Ashley led the dramatic effort to pass the 13th Amendment through the House of Representatives. That amendment, which helped legalize what Lincoln had done with the Emancipation Proclamation and what Congress had done in their abolition of slavery on a selective basis to a total abolition through a constitutional amendment. And that amendment was passed in the spring, although it didn't take effect until the December of 1865. Well, Ashley also gained some notoriety by a couple of years later by leading the impeachment effort against Andrew Johnson, the president that, of course, succeeded Lincoln. And, of course, through that action, he already was an abolitionist Republican and therefore not very popular with the Democrats, the Northern Democrats. And I should emphasize here, and we don't have time to go into it, but the politics of the Civil War in the North is pretty involved and fascinating. Simply put, though, the Republicans were relatively united behind Lincoln. They weren't all united between abolitionists and mild abolitionists. You know, there are varying degrees. But the Democrats were absolutely split down the line. Most of them opposed equal rights for African Americans. However, the war Democrats, that included many of the immigrant Irish, along with a large number of other Northern Democrats, believed strongly in the Union, and they were willing to fight for the Union, and therefore they're called war Democrats. The peace Democrats were somewhat mixed among themselves, but they were not willing to fight for the war. They wanted the war settled. Some would go as far as allowing slavery to continue to exist in the South, while others felt that the agreement with the South should end in phased out slavery. So, you know, there were a lot of varying degrees. And of course, this guy was caught in the middle after leading the impeachment effort against President Johnson that failed by a single vote. He had the honor of being nominated by General Grant, or President Grant at that point, to come to Montana Territory as the governor. And after a long struggle to get him to the job, he spent 1 year trying to convince a large Democrat population in Montana, many of whom were war Democrats, others were peace Democrats. It didn't make any difference. They all opposed Ashley, and he failed and left the territory within a year. We heard earlier a bit about this man, and that's Sidney Edgerton, and anxious to admit the free territories that I mentioned earlier was part of Lincoln's policy. Edgerton had been successful in getting the Montana Territory created. He'd been the Chief Justice of Idaho Territory at that point, went back to Washington, lobbied with Lincoln and Congress, and succeeded with Ashley's leadership in getting Montana Territory created. The Civil War was at a critical stage when Montana came into the Union, with General Grant applying continuous pressure on General Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia in a series of bloody battles in central Virginia that began with the Wilderness, extended to Spotsylvania, and was just underway at Cold Harbor. The terrible fighting and heavy losses in Virginia weighed heavily on public opinion, and of course, that was all leading into the 1864 election, when, because of Grant's successes and because of the improved outlook for the Union, President Lincoln was able to turn back and defeat the infamous General McClellan that we heard a bit about earlier. Some of the first 8 territorial governors that came to Montana Territory, of course, Thomas Francis Meagher was not actually a governor sent to Montana Territory. He was sent as territorial secretary, and because of a couple of absences of Edgerton's and then a new government, a governor that was promoted and named by Lincoln, and that was Governor Green Clay Smith, and he had absence as well. Thomas Francis Meagher, who most of you know very well, I'm sure, but had led rebellions as a very young man in Ireland, had been condemned to death, been commuted to life exile to Tasmania, managed to escape from there, came to New York in the 1850s, became a very popular lecturer on the Irish question back in England and Ireland, and he also entered the war very early, leading, raising troops and leading immigrant Irishmen in the Irish Brigade. Now, Thomas Francis Meagher, his time in Montana has left him with many memories, including this wonderful wartime statue in front of the Montana State Capitol. This was a rededication several years ago in his Jubilation T corn pose, charging somewhere in Montana for the Civil War. The Civil War dislocated and relocated countless Americans. Some men came into the new Montana Territory to escape service and escape the ravages of the war. Some came they all came for opportunity. Some came to chase the elephant, seeking their fortunes. Women and children followed the men arriving by steamboat or wagon into the rough Montana frontier. Shortly after creation of Montana Territory, Governor Edgerton hastily ordered a census that found some 15,800 residents of the new territory and about 11,500 packed in Madison County along Alder Gulch. The Civil War affected the new Montana Territory in many ways. We heard earlier talk about the about the Plummer Vigilante encounters. The Vigilantes allied with Edgerton acted swiftly during the winter of 1863-64 to hang or drive out the outlaw elements under corrupt, my preferences are known, corrupt Sheriff Henry Plummer. The Vigilantes filled the law and order gap until territorial government could be organized. Because of the war, no Army troops were available to protect the mining camps and the Mullan and Bozeman roads from raids and incidents with native Indians. Some private civilian armies and a fledgling Montana militia tried to fill the void but proved inadequate. Calls for Army permanent presence in the new territory led to armed shipments, but no troops were available until after the war. Ironically, the first soldiers to be stationed in Montana were ex-Confederate soldiers called Galvanized Yankees. These were Confederates captured by Union forces who chose to enlist for frontier service rather than remain in prisoner of war camps. On May 12, 1865, First Lieutenant Horace S. Hutchins of Company H, 1st U.S. Volunteer Militia, and 9 men embarked the steamboat Deer Lodge at Fort Rice, Dakota Territory, under orders from their commander to, quote, control the trade with Indians between Fort Benton and Fort Union. The Deer Lodge arrived at Fort Benton on May 30th, and the soldiers remained there during the summer to provide transportation security. Here in a new sketch by artist David Parchin of Fort Benton, the camp is set up just on the north side of the trading post, Fort Benton. And this Galvanized Yankee group, they eventually raised 6 regiments, and it took, it relieved 6 Union residents to go back to fight in the war. The monumental Civil War had ended. Montana Territory was struggling into existence, and as far as the Mullan Road, portions of it had worked, but just barely. Some better than others. For instance, the portion along the eastern segment evolved with the great quantity of goods and passengers arriving on the steamboats in that 1860s era. It evolved rapidly into what was called the Montana's Benton Road, and Lee Hanchett has a very fine book out on that. But it took civilian efforts to make the improvements that were needed, for instance, through Prickly Pear and portions of that eastern segment. And King and Gillette and other creative pioneers took the Mullan Road far beyond where Mullan and his government money had left it, all the way to today's railroads and highways. And I'd add here a couple of additional things. Let me check the time. I'm almost out of time, but I will say that in my Life and Death on the Upper Missouri, the stories of Johnny Healy, there's a wonderful account of Healy's of the burning of the Blackfoot community or Blackfoot government farm 2 years after Ken's incident there and his 1864 period. In 1866, it was attacked and burned. Actually, it blew up because it was storing dynamite for the Diamond R, and in the fires that the Blackfoot raiding party lit, it overwhelmed the building and it blew up. I'd also mention that I've got brochures I'll be glad to hand out later, but in May and June of this year, starting now, on the 8th of May, we'll have a series of 10 events in Great Falls that commemorate Montana Territory and the Civil War. And they range from things, the first event is very appropriately African Americans, the Civil War through African American eyes. And other events will be things like descendants bringing their treasures from Civil War ancestors, photos, diaries, letters, and so on, in for a kind of a show and tell and a discussion of doing research on Civil War ancestors. Other events are literature, music, and so on. A couple of fun events are going to be reenactor groups. The first Montana formed Civil War reenactment group, the first U.S. Volunteer Infantry, will set up an encampment in Library Park in Great Falls, and on the 31st of May, for 6 hours during that Saturday afternoon, they'll be in camp and have formations and be firing their rifles and so on. We also have another couple of enactments. Clara Barton, who lives in Laurel, did you know? and her husband, who's going to be playing a Union officer, will be there at another event. So there's a whole series of events. Whether you can come over to Great Falls Ed or not, you're welcome to pick up a brochure. I've got a good number of them here. So thank you very much. And welcome to Fort Benton next year.
Our next speaker is a staple at these events year after year, and a Missoula guy and a Bobcat, I should add, and a Grizzly, okay. Went to engineering school, I believe, in Bozeman, correct? Bill Weichel's a mostly retired professional land surveyor and engineer with in excess of 40 years in the professions. In the mid-1990s, he began researching the Mullan Military Wagon Road, and his professional background offered him a unique insight into the equipment and methods that were being used for mapping of the road, and using historic maps and field evidence to determine the probable location of the original road. He has obtained a significant collection of historic surveying, measuring, and mapping equipment, including items that are characteristic of those that would have been used during construction of the road. He's provided numerous presentations to a variety of groups about the equipment and methods used by the persons under the command of John Mullan. Those of you who have been out on the road with him probably know him as the no-no man. Most places where we think the road is, no, and he's usually right. But boy, when he agrees with you, it's the best feeling in the world.
Yeah, we had one of those agreements the other day out on the west side of Medicine Tree Hill, and that doesn't happen often. Anyhow, I got to get my clock out here because in case nobody else keeps time on me. Anyhow, my talk is about mapping the Mullan Military Wagon Road and subsequent road changes. I address it that way rather than calling it mapping the Fort Walla Walla and Fort Benton Military Wagon Road. It's too long, but that technically is the name of the road. That appeared on the maps of the report. Okay, for those of you who do not know, the first route was 1859 to 1860. Started down here in Fort Walla Walla, went up through the south side of Coeur d'Alene Lake, come over the mountains, down the St. Regis River, through the Missoula area, or up the Clark Fork through the Missoula area, over into the Deer Lodge Valley, back into the Helena area, and on up to Fort Benton. When you think about how the road, that it was an engineered road, I always hear everybody say John Mullan engineered a road. Well, very little of it was actual engineering. It was deciding, I guess, that we're going to go this direction. And when you're in open country, where there's no construction to take place, I call it first wagon wins. You know, we're heading in from the Frenchtown Valley, and we can see the Hellgate Canyon. We're heading toward the Hellgate Canyon. Maybe somebody's out there a couple miles ahead with a white flag that says, no, you got to go over this way a ways. And so we go over that, we start going that way. And that's, you know, makes the wagon track. At stream crossings, at stream crossings, earth was moved to allow the road to get in and out of the stream. If they had a bank that you couldn't get down, you had to do some carving. Where it was located through timber country, sometimes, like the one we saw in Medicine Tree Hill the other day, they just wove around the trees. Some areas, I believe, like over in the Wallace-Kellogg area, they cut trees down as low as they could get them and straddled them, and in some cases took the stumps out. Some areas it was necessary to perform extensive excavation or fill work when there was no route through reasonably level ground. So that's the areas like the big side cut and like the 3-mile grade that we'll see tomorrow. Okay. As the road was located, constructed, they had a crew that followed behind the wagons and made measurements of the road alignment, in some cases the road elevation, and then a lot of features alongside the road. I list there the various tools that they had, which is kind of what I've got up on the table here if you've looked ahead of time to see that. One of the things that they had to do, they got latitude and longitude locations at some 5 or 6 spots to where they could leave a crew there for a long time, take a lot of celestial observations, and determine a fairly reasonable degree of accuracy of what the location, latitude and longitude of that particular spot was. You know, in that time period, a degree of accuracy of 1 mile in latitude was feasible, and a degree of accuracy of 10 miles in longitude was feasible. To determine those, they used a sextant along with an artificial horizon. I won't go through the mechanics of how that works, but through observation of the sun and stars, you could, and then some calculation gyrations, you could determine reasonably close of where you were at latitude and longitude. Along with that, they had a clock chronometer, which they needed for longitude to determine the time locally in comparison to the time at some known some known longitude. I feel like I'm almost worn out today from walking around. I should have started talking first thing this morning. Okay, in between those pieces or those spots of known latitude, longitude, they ran course and distance measurements. So, like this is a drawing of a stretch of the road somewhere out in the Alberton area, I believe, and they have these stations along the road. This is, I think, I can't quite tell, but 31, maybe 32. And basically, they weren't mapping every little nuance in the road. They were mapping from point to point that they could reasonably measure a distance of and get a direction between 2 points. So in this case, they're getting a direction and distance from here to here, but they're drawing it that they've actually got a kind of little loop in the road there. They're determining those directions with either a compass. This is an early vane compass, I call it. It's a surveyor's compass. I think was maybe the proper terminology. Or they were using a transit. They had both. The transit again had a compass in it. In this area here had a compass. but you could also turn angles if you wanted to, whereas you couldn't really do that with the compass. So they would, using either one of those instruments, they would be determining a direction of the roadway from point to, selected point to point. They measured the distance using a wagon wheel odometer or revolution counter. I'm not sure exactly whether this was the type they used. This particular one, I believe, dates from that time period. But they address in the report that they did have some sort of a wagon wheel odometer. And the way this thing operated, this is a picture in Yellowstone Park during Jackson's survey of Yellowstone Park. And you can see this little thing right there. That is essentially this canister inside of a leather case, and it's strapped to a wagon wheel. I'll show you just in general how this thing would work. This thing sat inside of a case. This thing was inside of a case, and it's got a dial on here, and then it's got a fixed worm screw here. So no matter where that case was at on the wheel, as the wheel went around, that counter would hang down, and that gear would turn against the worm screw, and it would count the revolutions. And so what you would do is at the beginning of one of these courses, you would have a reading on here, and at the end you would have a reading, and then I'll show what happened. So anyhow, they may have had something like this. This was much more desirable to measure with than a four-wheel device, because like this, where they're going through Yellowstone Park, this horse can step over limbs, and that two-wheel cart can go right over the limbs, logs laying on the ground, and you can still be reading. You're not going to be as accurate as you would, but it will still read. Okay. They created charts like this. This is actually taken from one of their sets of field notes, rather than at the end of each time where they got the number of revolutions, sitting down and multiplying the circumference of the wagon wheel by the number of revolutions. They would take the wagon wheel ahead of time, and they'd set up a table to where you had one revolution was 10 feet 11 inches, two was 21:10, etc. You go all the way through to 100, and then you jump to 145 is 3/10 of a mile, 194 is 4, etc., etc. And so by doing all of that ahead of time, then as they went along and they got their revolution count, they could go to the table, get a number. They might be in their notebooks. They might be plotting it at 1 inch to the mile scale. And so they could actually draw it as they went along. They could draw the alignment, which as a surveyor, that's the best way to do it, rather than just collecting data in the field and then coming back and trying to interpret it when you get into the office. As they went along mapping alongside the road. So here we are, we're following the road, and we've got all these angles. Okay, and each one of these is a course and a distance. Well, we plot that out. And as we come to, let's say right here, okay, we see the tip of this island out in the river, and so we get a compass direction to it or an angle off of this line, and then when we get down to this one, we can see that same point again, and so we take another compass direction, and because we've got this plotted to scale, we can plot those angles and get the position of the end of that island. We can also do mountain peaks. And so there's some stuff that you see where they've essentially physically located on their maps. You'll see all these mountain peaks. And these, contrary to Dan McDermott here, These mountain peaks, they didn't go all out to all top all of those and try to locate them. They were locating them by angular measurement, simple trigonometry. They recorded their data in a sheet like this. These were pre-printed sheets. They had all these headings on it. They were pre-printed sheets from somewhere back east, and they brought them out, and that's what they worked with. And so they would record in here, okay, those stations numbers. So we're at station 218. We've got an odometer reading of 2524. Okay, at the next one we've got 2695. So we've got 171 revolutions of the wagon wheel in that course. We went 0.2 miles, and in this case, the course, they're working off of azimuth, which is a degrees right from north. In this case, that's a north azimuth, and so they're going essentially north 35 east. They're on gentle rise. They're 60 yards from water. Left end of an island bears 351, which is north 9 degrees west. So they're recording all of this data and as they're going on, and then maybe on the other side of the page they're drawing it, so that they've got, yes?
Where did you see those sheets? I've never seen
These in microfilm.
Oh, they're on microfilm?
It's in somewhere. It's in their books. It's in the books, and I copied this years ago off of the microfilm that they'd acquired at the University of Montana. Yeah, and it was hard to read, very hard to read. I mean, the reality is if I could go back and spend 35 years interpreting every one of these pieces of paper like that, I could probably pin down pretty well where stuff went. But that's even to get through one page, like somebody was saying when Stewart was talking about trying to read what John Mullan was saying, is a day a page. Oops, excuse me. Okay, they could also determine height with respect to the road of objects in vicinity of the road. Okay, they had done that triangle, and so by their scale, they knew how far this H distance was. So they could turn a vertical angle here with that transit to the top of that peak and get their vertical. All never having to leave the roadway. In today's world, I always say that, me being an old-time surveyor, if I wanted to know the elevation of the top of Mount Jumbo, I would come down here and I'd set a baseline up somewhere out here and measure the length of that baseline and turn vertical angles to the top of Mount Jumbo and horizontal angles from the two pieces on that baseline. Modern day surveyor would go out there and spend 5 hours climbing to the top of Mount Jumbo with his GPS. All right? And it wouldn't gain him much more than what I already had. In today's world, that's he or she. This is a sketch that appears in their, in all of these logs. This is a sketch to where they're kind of drawing the mountains, the characteristics of the mountains here. And then these numbers, you can't tell it here, but these numbers are, like 800 feet, 700 feet, 600 feet type of thing, so that they have kind of a relationship of how high those mountains are. The primary purpose of doing that is that ultimately they're going to make maps, and those maps 10 years from then are going to be discussed with the Department of the Army or somebody planning on a railroad, and they're going to want to know, what are we going through? What are we building through? And so that's what they got to be able to go back and do, is they've got to be able to create these maps so that you've got talking points, when you're 3,000 miles and 10 years away. They determined elevations at some spots using a cistern barometer. There's record of at the top of Sohan's Pass, which is, for those who are not familiar, is south of Lookout Pass going into Idaho. They set a cistern barometer up here like this for weeks. And they took barometric readings every day and then temperature readings. And by meaning all of those out, they could get a reasonable elevation of the top of that, of the top of Sohan's Pass. And I've looked at it in the old maps, and you know, you don't know exactly where they were on the top of the pass, but record-wise with today's elevations, it's 30, 40 feet of the same elevation. In between, you know, they go to the top of Sohan's Pass, and they get this precise elevation, so to speak, with all of these repetitive all these observations. Well, then they could take an aneroid barometer, and they could check it against, on one day against their cistern barometer. They could go down the mountain 20 miles, get a reading there, and then come back at the end of the day and check it, and they would have determined a reasonable elevation difference between a number of points, depending on how many they wanted to do.
Did they know about magnetic north back then?
Oh, yes. Yes, by all means.
The declinations were factored in.
Well, yeah, well, I don't know whether they put it in or not as they went. They may have come in later, you know. Some compasses, like the one I showed you earlier, some compasses in the time period had the ability to set declinations, and some did not. They also had a Y level. There's a record to where they ran, they ran elevations just as Stuart and I, Kurt, would have done 20 years ago using a rod and a level. They ran elevations from the Cataldo Mission up the, whatever that river, I can't remember what it's called, over Sohan's Pass and down to Cantonment, Jordan. And it was basically, if any of you are familiar with the methodology, it's backsight, foresight, backsight, foresight, backsight, foresight, just repetitively setting up the rod and carrying elevations. And I know you can see the difference. I mean, that's a long 2,400 feet up and 1,600 feet back down. But the primary reason for running this is they recognized that if they were going to get a railroad over there, they needed to know what kind of elevation difference they were dealing with and what kind of distance. And if you go on some of their maps, and I think you've seen the ones to where they actually have the blue lines and the red lines, but they show a tunnel under the mountain, about a 2-mile long tunnel from the St. Regis River over to the Mullan area.
It was further east than Sohan Pass.
Right.
It really was east of Lookout Pass.
Yeah. So their end product from you know, obtaining all this information was these various kinds of maps. They had kind of a, you know, a work map. And so this particular work map is coming through the Missoula area. You can see here's a mileage, 361 miles. For those of you who've been around Missoula forever, you can remember this island before they created Karis Park. And so they had it sketched in there. Here we go around into East Missoula and then around to Marshall Grade out here. But there's some maps, some of those that are probably missing, but we've got one series of maps that 1 inch to a mile that are very good resources for trying to determine where the road might have gone. They created some detailed maps of specific areas. This is over in the Kellogg, Wallace, Mullan area. I think the reason they may have done this that detailed was that was going to be another tough area to put a railroad through. Okay? In this particular case, I'm showing it up against a Forest Service map, and to show how accurate they were. If you look at where I bring these lines down, they're consistent points, and I've scaled it. I shrunk the Forest Service map to match the other one, or expanded it. But you can see, like, this feature coming around here, there's the one in the modern map. The only thing that happened is right here, they blew a mile in their measurements. They screwed up a mile when they were creating their drawing. And I can't remember which way it goes. probably short because this should be up here to match up with these lines. Then they drew the large detailed map for their final report. This is the map of the mountain section in our area. So they got the Higgins and Warden store. They got Cantonment Right out in Bonner, Hugo's Bridge and the Medicine Tree down, which will be at the end of our field trip tomorrow, and then Mullan Pass. And these, you know, when you work with these are all resources to try to determine where it is, but this is, you know, where the road is, but this is a scale of 1 foot equals 1,000,000 feet. So it's not, you can't just blow it up to 1 inch to a mile and be able to overlay something. Okay, so then road changes. What generation of road are we talking about when we refer to the Mullan Road? This one, paved section out by Frenchtown, I believe. Gravel section out by Hewson. Road cut out just west of Alberton that was created in 1908 when they built the Milwaukee. This one, which is a piece we'll walk on tomorrow, or close to what we'll walk on, which was the 1861-1862 3-mile grade construction. Or this one, which is the first thing that ever got me really excited about the Mullan Road, which is a little cut down west of Alberton that was bypassed in 1908. They cut it off when the Milwaukee went through there, and probably until I walked in there one day, nobody had really recognized for what it was in 80, 90 years. Okay, when we're in open country and the wagon's going toward Hellgate Canyon and they've got a track, well, and they hit a mud hole or they hit something that the next wagon isn't going to blindly follow them. They go somewhere new, because it doesn't matter. We own the whole country, and all we're trying to do is just try to get a wagon track between those two forts. So then again, as years went by, say a wagon traveled through going one direction, and then and there was a big bend in the trail at that time, or road at that time, and they looked at it and they said, God, when I'm coming back through, I'm just going to cut that corner off. I call it the college student theory, and you go on campus, every time you put a sidewalk in, the college students cut the corner. Well, you're going to do the same thing with a wagon. You aren't just going to blindly go across just because that's where the previous track went. As long as you know that, you're still going within the same corridor, you make changes. And at that point in time, especially early on, nobody really cared. Nobody owned the land. There hadn't been any homesteaders in yet, so you didn't care. There were new routes constructed in 1861 and 1862. This right here is the 3-mile grade that we're going to see tomorrow. Okay, this little thing right here. I'm sorry this is so blurry, but it's off of a 1/2 inch to the mile map, and it's pretty hard to expand. But this little piece right here was probably the first one that they built in 5960, or the path they followed in 5960, and then this one was the one that they came back and constructed to bypass all of these crossings of the Clark Fork River. New routes were created to access new towns. Okay, you can see here they're showing on Mullan, on the original maps, they're showing the road right there. There's Bearmouth right there. I think, is Sally still here, or did she leave? I think she left. Okay. I was hoping she'd still be here because
Okay, the picture that she showed of the road, the Mullan Road, in the Bearmouth area, in one of her slides when she was talking about the area going up through there, that was taken right in here. Okay, the original road went right over here. But this, when after Bearmouth was established, which was late 1860s, I believe, well, as soon as Bearmouth's established, any wagon coming is going to divert over here to get some supplies or to stop and check things out. And so they abandoned this and they start using this. And then also, this became a plowed field, so they moved it over against the edge of the hill. They were moved out of travel route of farmable areas, okay? Area that I went down years ago down by Drummond, I had a fellow, that old gentleman down there, took us out and he says, this is the Mullan Road. This has been the Mullan Road since I was a kid. Well, he was a kid in 1910, 50 years after the Mullan Road was constructed. And so you look at it close, and here's where the original road was. It's a nice alluvial, kind of an alluvial fan, nice and uniform down there, but somebody wanted to plow this. Somebody wanted to farm this alluvial fan, so they pushed the road over onto the hillside, and this is all cut. There was no, Mullins wasn't going to cut it. They weren't going to cut if they didn't need to. They were just going to drive. It was shifted in 1883 to allow for railroad construction. Okay, it originally went somewhere down in here like this, going out to the east of Missoula. Well, when the railroad came in, railroad didn't, had to have an alignment, and so they didn't want to have the road crossing back and forth over them, and they would just, once they built the railroad, they'd just come down with a wagon along one side or the other and create a new path, because at that point it didn't really matter whether you were on the original path or not. A lot of subdivision overlaid the road. In Missoula, probably the first thing that really happened was when they started to lay the town site of Missoula out, the road went through here somewhere. Well, Front Street, if you look at where the road probably went, Front Street was where they turned off of the road and came down to the Missoula Mills, and then turned off, left Missoula Mills and went back to the road out here somewhere. Well, when it come time to lay out a town where you had parallel streets, they just kind of abandoned that old road and put in Broadway and Main. Again, because it really didn't matter whether they're preserving the original alignment. When I ran into this one last year when I was trying to do a thing for the Surveyors Conference. When I go to the GLO plats, the road is shown up here where we cross Reserve and the current Mullan Road. It's shown right up here. Well, I talked to Mike Flynn from the Flynn, who's the Flynn ditch operator, and he told me about when they constructed this ditch. There's a ditch that goes right along here and then follows the edge of the bank right here in front of Walmart. Well, if I come in here and I homestead this area, and I've got this wagon track out here, and I've got a ditch over here, which forces me into having two places to farm, I'm going to plow the road up and just drive a wagon a couple of times in the new area. Because it doesn't matter. There's not that many people traveling on it. Sir, yes, sir.
Why was the Mullan Monument located near the old Fox Theater? When I came in 1960, that was one of the monuments.
Because they stole it out of Bonner and put it down there along Front Street because everybody thought Front Street was the old Mullan Road. Is that a satisfactory answer? Or is it a too curt of an answer? That monument that was down at Main Orange in front was the monument that had originally been in Bonner. They moved it into Missoula, and now it's back in Bonner.
But they could have put it in a lot of different places in Missoula.
No, they couldn't. There was only one piece of land that didn't have a building on it, and that was that little triangle. There were changes done in 1908 with the construction of the Milwaukee. That piece that I showed early on of the little thing through the rock cut is, I think, right here. And the Milwaukee came through and cut that off. And so they rerouted the road and came up through here. You know, again, I mean, if any of you ever studied railroad, there's not many, in those days, there wasn't many rules with railroad. They won all the time, whether it be a river, a road, or anything, they won. So yeah, so there's a change that was made by the Milwaukee. And the Milwaukee, when they were doing this, they had big crews, and they had, I think when we first went up and looked at this, there was about 20 black powder cans sitting right there. You know, old rusted out black powder cans that they'd use to blast some of this stuff out of here. There were new routes that were created for car traffic. You know, a lot of, I think, when we were talking about the steepness of the Mullan, of the wagon road, cars, the early cars, the only way they're going up that is backwards because they had no fuel pumps. And so they'd have to turn around and back up it, and oftentimes it might be too steep for them. And so you'd get places to where, you know, you change the route. You change the route in order to accommodate car traffic. So like this, this is showing the road over Camel's Hump, which those of you that aren't familiar is kind of to the northwest of St. Regis. Okay, and so this is an estimate of where the old road was. And then here's where the road is now. It goes in and out all these draws in order to maintain a grade that a car can travel. Because they couldn't come up, especially like right here. We've been out and kind of looked at where this is, and that's a very steep grade. But a wagon could do it by double teaming, and then coming down, they could chain drag, or they could log drag, or they could chain lock. In the later dates, I don't have anything to illustrate this, but when they started making paved roads, and they started having equipment that could cut and fill to you know, in a much easier fashion than in the old days, then they started, you know, and they're starting to work with cars, they just straighten them out. And sometimes they might buy right-of-way at that point, but you don't, it's hard to even find the record of what that right-of-way might have been. So, in my opinion, it's likely there are a few places where the center line of any existing traveled way coincides with the center line of the original Mullan or Military Wagon Road. It just, you know, there is too many things that transpired over the years to where, you know, it all follows the same corridor, but it doesn't follow the tread. But there are a few places like we've seen. I've probably, in the 20 years I've been around this, I've seen maybe 4 miles that we can confirm were probably the last thing that went over them could have been a wagon.
When two wagons met one another, what was the rule of the road?
Biggest gun wins, I suppose. I don't know, Jim. I don't think they record that stuff in history all the time.
They didn't have pullouts.
Not on the mountain sections. No, I think somebody was telling us that earlier, was talking about taking the wagon. Jim was telling us about taking the wagons apart. When they met on the top of the big side cut, neither one of them was going to be able to back up, and so they'd take the wagon apart and throw it up on the hillside and unload everything, put the wagon up on the hillside, pull one through, drag it back down, and put the wagon back together. Yeah, the smallest one with the less load. There you go, yeah. Okay, hold on. So that's it. I got any questions from you? Sir.
I've understood that they tried to get a 20-foot width to the road. And when you're going through mountainous areas like we have here in Montana, I wonder what percentage of the road they were able to achieve that dimension.
I have never seen anything in a side cut situation that was really much wider than a wagon. I think that, it seems to me years ago, I read that like when they were going through timber, They would try to get 20 foot or more so that they could have light through there, if nothing else, you know, and make it a little more, you know, so, I mean, when you start going to where if you've got a 6.5 foot wide wagon and you've got 7 feet between trees, you know.
The 20 foot was something that was ideal, but in this country, probably not common.
Well, like I say, is that coming through the Missoula Valley, there was no width at all. It was just a driven wagon.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
I was surprised to see the shot you had of a cut that they actually did. I'm curious, what is the biggest cut that you've seen that they did?
That one right there. Well, actually, that's a rock cut that I saw. If you go up on the big side cut above, there's very significant dirt, you know, dirt cuts up there. I don't know how much rock was cut up there, but they had 160 workers for 6 weeks on that stretch over the big side cut, which is what, a couple miles long, Jim? Yeah. Yes, sir.
That cistern barometer,
Yes,
how does that work again?
barometric pressure. Yeah.
When was that first available? Is that ancient or fairly modern?
God, I've read this at one time, maybe like the 1600s was when they first started to understand the concept. This particular type, if you look you know, like Pike and trying to think of some of the other early explorers, they all have this cistern barometer. And they always break the damn thing because it's very fragile. They came in a leather case, and mine's broken. Mine, I've got the piece of glass off the end and I've got the mercury, but I need to have it fixed, yeah. Yes, Jim?
Were Asians employed as the civilians, or did that come later with railroads?
I think just with the railroads. I don't think there was the Asian populace at that point. And with the mines, yeah. Yeah. Okay, any other question? One more?
Did you ever make a list of where they had the observatories? I got 6. Do you have any other accounting?
No, I think I picked up somewhere back to where they had done it, you know, that they did it in Hellgate, they did it in Solon's Pass, they did it in Walla Walla, they did it in Fort Benton, and beyond that, I think
St. Regis.
St. Regis.
Yeah. I was wondering if you came across anything else.
We're at?
Calvary Mission.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah, the mission.
I hope it was good. Now, for our last thing of today, we have Kim Brigham. I probably should find his bio here, just to give him credit for what he is. Kim grew up in the Missoula area and has written for the Missoulian newspaper for 34 years, most recently as a county government and history writer. The latter has spurred his interest, research, and numerous articles on the Mullan Road in early-day western Montana. He's a past presenter at the Mullan Road conferences and was a contributor to the upcoming anthology, The Mullan Road, Carving a Passage Through the Frontier Northwest, by Paul D. McDermott, Ronald Grimm, and Philip Mobley. So Kim, or some here somewhere. One thing to look at just is, while I'm thinking of it, is this, okay, for the bus thing tomorrow, you want to park in that kind of area that I kind of got squared, which is kind of an asphalt area up to the north of Joker's Wild, which is out here, the next building up. Okay, thanks.
Right on time, it's 4:15. It's good time. My job here is to be very quick and do it quickly. My thought here for these last 15 minutes before we headed out is to give a kind of a contextual idea of what we're going to be looking at tomorrow on the bus trip. Before I do that, though, there will be some people that won't be here tonight that are here, and I would really like to recognize the people that have worked so hard to put this thing on. And so I'm going to ask Marcia, would you stand up, please? Marcia Porter from Missoula. Kay Strombo sitting over there by the door from Superior. Ruth Baker, I know you're there in the very back room, Ruth from Stevensville. We've had a lot of hard work being done by several individuals, and we didn't know what we were doing. So we're hoping it all comes together. Most of you know that the Mullan Road was constructed in 2 sweeps. The first sweep was 1859 to 1860. That winter was spent up at Cantonment, Jordan, by DeBorgia, 15 miles up the St. Regis River from St. Regis, somewhere in that order. The second sweep also started in Walla Walla in 1861 and concluded, it essentially concluded at what's now Bonner, Milltown, in May of 1862. There was a number of purposes for the second sweep. One main goal was to throw the road to the north of Lake Coeur d'Alene instead of the south. In other words, through Spokane. And that was a major change in the route. Another need on that second sweep was to try to address all those crossings over the Coeur d'Alene and the St. Regis River on this side. I don't think that was ever successfully done, but they spent a lot of time doing that. And the third major topic or major issue that Mullan wanted to get completed was building a bridge over the Big Blackfoot River, so he could keep the road on the north side of the Clark Fork River all the way from St. Regis, where they crossed with a ferry, all the way to Medicine Tree Hill. Tomorrow, then, our plan is to kind of investigate that second sweep. That will be kind of our focus. And so we'll get a chance to see where Cantonment Right was established in November of 1861 and was finally abandoned in May of 1862. In one of the coldest winters on record, and I know you hear that all the time, the coldest winter on record. I think Bill Young's, some students at Eastern Washington have posted a treatise on the winter of 1861-62. It indeed was legendary, and they spent it on the most of them spent it on the cold bluff where Milltown, Montana sits today. And why he said it there is a matter of debate that we can look at tomorrow. It was pointed out to me earlier in the day that we tend to have a vocabulary of place names, etc., that not everybody relates to. And so when we're talking about some things that we're going to east of Missoula tomorrow, these are names that you won't be familiar with, or you may not be familiar with. I've got a couple of them written down here. We're talking Tura Peak. That's the mountainside that 3 Mile Grade will be on, which is 3 or 4 miles east of Bonner, right alongside the interstate. All this is right alongside the interstate. That's one of the major themes of this trip tomorrow, will be to see in this fairly narrow river valley how much we have changed the river. The river channels have been changed immensely by the railroads, by the highways, etc. And it'll be clearly visible to us tomorrow. So you keep hearing 3 Mile Grade. I think a couple of presenters have had that Sohan sketch of 3 Mile Grade. That was a major work project in the winter of 1861-62. It was set at one of 4 winter camps that John Mullan established in addition to Cantonment Right at the confluence of the Big Blackfoot and the Hellgate Rivers. So we have the main bridge building crew there at the confluence in Cantonment Right, but 4 other camps upriver, as far as about 30 miles upriver, well, 25 miles upriver, where mountain cuts, side cuts were made to avoid those river crossings that Bill just showed us on that one map. Yet there were 11 in 1860. The first sweep in 1859, 1860, there were 11 river crossings that he did nothing about between here and Medicine Tree Hill, another one of those vocabulary terms, Medicine Tree Hill, which is going to be our terminus tomorrow where we turn around. But he built 4 or 5 side cuts, went up on the mountain, in other words, to avoid river crossings that avoided all but one river crossing, and finally built a bridge at the base of Medicine Tree Hill, which was the only crossing of the Hellgate River from clear down at St. Regis. He kept it on the north bank all the way up to Medicine Tree Hill, which is 30 miles east of Bonner, or east of Missoula. So that was a major project, not only to build the Blackfoot Bridge in that cold winter, but also to make these side cuts. And that's what we're going to be looking at tomorrow. We'll be stopping at Beaver Tail Hill. We'll be stopping at Rocky Point, one of Sohan's favorite sketches, and I think it's going to be on, Dan says it's going to be on the cover of the book, the sketch of Rocky Point, which is at near the Rock Creek interchange. What else we got? Kendall Creek is the eastern end of 3 Mile grade. Kendall Creek is the first major drainage upriver from the Blackfoot, and it's about 5-6 miles. First, what became of the Mullan, well, it's now the Mullan Road Conference. It was Mullan Days. At that time, it was a special day to commemorate the movement of the Mullan Monument in St. Regis by the St. Regis Community Council. It was a centennial Montana's centennial in 1989. That is 25 years ago. And they sustained this event and helped grow it to what it is today. The old Mullan Day celebrations, commemorations occurred someplace in Mineral County. And for 16 years until 2006. And then it went on down the road to Helena. But we have a certificate of appreciation for the Mineral County Historical Society, represented tonight by Kay Strombo and Glenn Kepke, and I'll read it to them. This certificate is presented to the Mineral County Historical Society for 25 years of service dedicated to preserving the history of the Mullan Road. Your tireless efforts, commitment, and ongoing research ensures the future preservation of the history of the Mullan Road. Presented May 3rd, 2014 by the 2014 Mullan Road Conference Committee, Missoula, Montana. If it weren't for these folks, we wouldn't be here tonight. That was Marcia's idea, by the way. Marcia Porter, thank you. That's not a door prize. Our speaker tonight has been waiting about a half hour longer than he thought he'd have to wait, but we are really excited to have Keith Peterson here with us tonight, and I really mean that. When I first started getting involved in this not very many years ago, I thought, the first thing I thought was, well, somebody needs to do the undaunted courage version of the Mullan Road, the Stephen Ambrose, Lewis and Clark thing, a blow-by-blow, you know, every angle you can think of the expedition, the road building expedition. And I also thought somebody needs to do John Mullan's life. Well, we got the Bible now, and it's still sizzling off the press from Washington State University Press, which, as I understand, Keith, you picked up the first box full yesterday in Pullman, correct? So, and they are marvelous. Believe me, I got a chance to look at a proof, and it's going to be a reference book for Mullanites from now on. I mean, this is the Bible in terms of John Mullan's life. And Keith is the Idaho State historian. Just a second, I got to find my cheat sheet. You want to introduce? He's I've got the wrong sheet. I'm sorry. That's what you're going to talk about. Okay, Idaho State historian and the associate director of the Idaho State Historical Society. He made a beeline here from Boise, where he filled in for the head director for the last 2 weeks, as I understand it. A frequent public speaker, he's the author of numerous articles and books about Idaho and the Northwest. He's the only person to have twice received the Idaho Book Award, the outstanding book on Idaho. He also received the first annual award for outstanding achievement in the humanities from the Idaho Humanities Council in 1986, the Presidential Medallion from Lewis Clark State College in 2006, and an honorary doctorate from the University of Idaho in 2014. Must have just happened. Next week. We are very pleased to have Keith Peterson here. Thanks, Keith.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm a little nervous because my cousin came from Helena, my cousin Joyce, who is here, and I know that reports are going to go out to the family. So whether I do well or not, just let Joyce know that you thought I did an outstanding job. So it really is a pleasure to be here. May is Archaeology and Historic Preservation Month in Idaho, and consequently, I am always on the road. So the last time I was able to attend one of these conferences was at Fort Benton in 2010, so it's a real pleasure to be here. And Kim, thanks for the nice introduction. There are a lot of people in this room who I'd like to thank who were with me over many years of writing this book, but I'm only going to mention a few. Ken Robison, thanks for all of your advice and for the photographs. Dan McDermott, thank you for, I can't imagine how many email conversations we had arguing about John Mullan, but especially thanks for your help in allowing me to better understand the really long and close relationship between Gus Sohan and John Mullan. And Kay Strombo and Bob Dunsmore, who's at this table, waded their way through the book when it was very much in draft form. Hopefully it's better now. It's largely better because of their advice, so thank you both very much for that. It's a real pleasure to be at a conference that is sponsored by the State Humanities Council. I'm a big fan of State Humanities Councils. You do outstanding work. Indeed, the Idaho Humanities Council provided a research fellowship to me, which allowed me to get to a lot of the places that I'm going to talk about tonight. As Kim mentioned, I picked up the book yesterday. I've kind of looked at it. I can guarantee you there are no upside-down pages, so with that, I would recommend that you definitely buy a copy or multiple copies. It's the world premiere here tonight. Besides, I don't want to cart them all the way back to Washington State University Press. It's an incredible book. I'm sure you will agree, so you'll want to get copies. And I'll be happy to autograph copies. I'll stay around as long as you want. Of course, you have to understand that as soon as I autograph it, the value goes down 50%. But tonight, I'm going to do my PowerPoint now. I have to do this with one hand. Tonight, the purpose of tonight is to get from this guy, who you probably all recognize as the young Army lieutenant who built a road near us, to get him until he became this guy, nearly a half a century later, a man who we really don't know an awful lot about. So that's our purpose. I work in Idaho, but I live just across the state line in Washington. So to get here, I crossed 3 states. John Mullan would have been pleased with my route because I did most of it on Interstate 90, which, as we all know from today, is and we all knew anyway, the most recent iteration of the Mullan Road. But had John Mullan had his way with the United States Congress, we would now be meeting in Missoula, a town in eastern Washington. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But it's great to be in Missoula, even though I had to travel through 3 states to get here, because this is the hometown of Addison Howard, who was the first biographer of John Mullan. And you can find her papers just across town at the University of Montana Archives. And if you look in there, you'll find some very interesting correspondence between Addison Howard and May Mullan, who was John's youngest daughter, who really encouraged Addison to write the first biography of her dad, and congratulated her when that article appeared in the Washington Historical Quarterly in 1934. The University of Montana Archives was one of more than 30 places where my wife, who is also a historian, having 2 historians in one family has many advantages. Being able to pay the mortgage is not one of them, but we do make good traveling companions. A very fine historian and an overly qualified research assistant on this trip who could not be here because she decided it was more important to be with our grandson in London than being in Missoula at a Mullan Road conference. So you go figure, I can't. Doesn't make any sense to me. But we found records trying to piece together the John Mullan story literally from coast to coast. I think it's because of the work of Addison Howard that those of you who live in Missoula know more about John Mullan than do the people in Bozeman. The university website of that other university that will remain unnamed, Bob Dunsmore is the one who pointed this out to me. On that campus, they have a residence hall called Mullan Hall, and the university website provides us the history on Mullan Hall and how it got its name. It was named for John Mullan. So far, so good. A lieutenant in the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, although the university eventually corrected the website, I think that the lesson here is clear. If you can't get your own university history correct, you're probably going to have a hard time on the football field against the University of Montana. But that story also symbolizes But that story also symbolizes to me the fact that really we don't know a lot about John Mullan. And tonight I want to tell you about some of the places that we visited and some of the stories that we found to try to piece together the life, particularly the life after his life after the road, which really has been a bit of a mystery, and partly because papers that allowed us to do the research in that part of his life only became available fairly recently. But first I have to make a confession tonight, to this group particularly. There was a time when I was not obsessed with John Mullan. If I'm honest, I have to admit that most of my life I was fairly normal and only mildly interested in the man, and my wife kind of hopes those days might return. So how did this obsession with John Mullan begin? So far as I can recollect, the first I'd ever heard of John Mullan was in an undergraduate history class at Washington State University in 1970 about Northwest history, and I heard about the Mullan Road and its significance, and I was immediately attracted to the story, and I would find myself as I was driving out away from campus on weekends around the inland Northwest finding lots of reminders of the story. I mean, you all know they're not hard to find. We have more than 24 massive stone monuments to the Mullan Road
in 3 states. In addition to that, there are historical markers and interpretive signs. It certainly is one, if not the most monumentalized event in the American West. It's worthy of a Civil War battlefield, I think, at times. I remember the exact moment that my curiosity about Mullan became an obsession, and it was on a winter night in 2007. I keep files, as all writers do, I guess, of potential writing projects, ideas that strike me at the time as surely Pulitzer Prize-winning books that haven't turned out that way yet. But nonetheless, I keep a lot of files. And in 2007, I went to the file under John Mullan, and I realized, pretty much to my surprise, that it was growing pretty thick. And I also realized, to my surprise, that the first one was dated 1986. I'd been fascinated with this guy for quite a while. And on that night in 2007, looking at that kind of growing file, I went to my computer, and that's what touched off my obsession with John Mullan. Up until then, I'd always been pretty frustrated with John Mullan. On the one hand, it seemed like we knew a lot about this guy, especially those of us who live out here. I mean, many of us live on or near the Mullan Road. We drive Interstate 90. We know of the town of Mullan. We know of the various schools named after Mullan, the banks, the community parks, the real estate developments. We know of modern housing developments and mobile home courts, street names in cities in 3 states that have Mullan's name. In my town, if you want to have a community event, you hire the Mullan Road Band. And as a historian, I also recognize that almost every book, a significant book of 19th century Northwest history, paid homage to the Mullan Road and its significant role in the development of a very large region. But with all of this Mullan mania around us, I really still didn't understand who John Mullan was. He appears regularly in our history books, but only for a brief chronological period of time, and then he pretty much exits the written record. He makes his first appearance, as we all know, as a young lieutenant just out of West Point who joins Isaac Stevens' Pacific Railroad Survey of 1853-54 to plot the course of a future transcontinental railroad. And as Isaac Stevens goes to Olympia to undertake his duties as the first territorial governor of Washington, he leaves Mullan behind in the Bitterroot Valley, and consequently he undertakes some of the most significant explorations in the American West, trying to find a place to build a wagon road, because in those days a wagon road was a necessary precursor if you're going to get the supplies in to build a railroad. Isaac Stevens was incredibly well connected in Washington, D.C. and in the Army, and so he made a very strong case that John Mullan should be the man who builds the road. And after a hiatus of a few years, when most articles about Mullan, if they mention anything about him at all during this period of time, say that he went to Florida to fight the Seminoles, which is erroneous, as I found out, but one of many myths that have developed about Mullan over the years. After that hiatus of a few years, he comes back and he builds the road. It was a remarkable achievement, as we all know. It was overseen by a young Army officer of drive and ambition, one of bulldog determination, undertaken by a man who cottoned absolutely no criticism of his work, traits that would characterize Mullan his entire life. Though most books say that John Mullan built his road between 1859 and 1862, most of you in this room know that actually he hired his first road crew in the spring of 1858. And in fact, he was working on an existing road out of the Dalles to make improvements on that road to connect with his road in Walla Walla. And he was at that work camp on a day in the spring when an Army courier came up on a hard-ridden horse with shocking news. Confederated inland tribes had massacred all of 160-man contingent sent out of Fort Walla Walla by Colonel Edward Steptoe. Well, the number of people killed turned out to be a gross exaggeration, but that was the first report that Mullan got. But there's not too much doubt that Edward Steptoe was almost beat George Custer to the last stand. And immediately the American press referred to the Army's defeat as Steptoe's disaster. What's almost always overlooked in this very well-known history event in Northwest history is that the Confederated tribes of inland Indians were not really after Colonel Edward Steptoe. He just happened to be in the way. Who they really wanted to get was John Mullan and his road-building crew. And the resulting War of 1858 was largely fought over John Mullan's road. Isaac Stevens had signed treaties with the inland tribes in 1855 to cede land in what is now eastern Washington state so that the federal government could build a road through that country, the road that eventually became John Mullan's Road. But the Senate had not ratified that treaty. And the Indians were well aware of Mullan's plans to build the road anyway. In fact, they were watching him as he was building the road out of the Dalles. And they rightfully considered the road to be a trespass, one that would forever change their way of life. A few days after the battle, Colonel Steptoe wrote to his superior officer, putting the episode in perspective, a perspective that has kind of been glanced over by most historians. But it's a perspective that places the Mullan Road at the center of the hostilities. The fight with my command only committed the Indians to hostilities a little earlier, and probably under more fortunate circumstances to us. The Coeur d'Alenes and Spokanes had bound themselves to massacre any party that should attempt to make a road survey. I make no question that Lieutenant Mullan's party has been saved from destruction. Mullan himself concurred. He wrote a couple days later to Steptoe, "Your encounter with the Indians has saved my party from disaster, probably from a complete massacre." The Army immediately sought revenge, and Lieutenant Mullan, unable to build his road because of the hostilities in the inland Northwest, volunteered to join Colonel George Wright's command to seek revenge for the Steptoe's disaster. The only part of the road that John Mullan had not been able to scout yet was that part through what is now eastern Washington state, which is exactly where George Wright was going to go. John Mullan signed up not so much to fight Indians, but rather to scout the future course of his road. That entire Wright campaign, often considered by military historians to be the most successful Army campaign of the 1850s, was really fought for two reasons: to avenge Steptoe's defeat and to completely pacify the Indians so that John Mullan could build his road. Mullan was placed in charge of a group of 30 Nez Perce allies who served as scouts for Mullan. And Mullan and the Nez Perce were among the first to draw any fire at the very first battle, the Battle of Four Lakes, not too far from today's Spokane. And just think about this guy was just in a battle. Think of the huge adrenaline rush that he must have had. The next day, he penned his field notes, those awful penmanship field notes that are hard to read about, we've heard a lot about today. And he spent almost all of his time discussing the future site of his road and the information he'd been able to gather to that. My party of assistants and I have been able to collect material for a complete map of the country from Fort Dalles to this point. I mean, this is really boring. This guy was just in battle. Only after doing this does he briefly note that we, quote, met the enemy and, quote, drove him from the ground. Well, I mean, it's a peculiar personality that will first write about the previous week's odometer readings before they write about the previous day's life-threatening battle. But it was typical of Mullan, who once he was on a job, he became obsessed to it, almost to the exclusion of everything else. I mean, let's face it, he was, in fact, the first Mullanite. So, despite seemingly insurmountable odds, harsh winters, unforgiving landscapes, high-priced labor, when Mullan was able to get out on the road, he persevered in his construction. He once wrote a quote that we heard today from a dismal winter camp when things were not going well. "As I was ordered to construct a road, it will be constructed." It's that perseverance that we commemorate at conferences like this, and it's that accomplishment of building that road that has fascinated generations of Northwesterners. But what about John Mullan himself? He exits Northwest history as a very young 32-year-old Army officer. The few biographical accounts that do exist about him hardly ever mention his life after 1862. And yet Mullan died in 1909, just about the time the first automobiles were starting to make their way over his road. He lived in an era of immense change. Surely, I thought, as I was putting all of those pieces and papers over all those years into the folder, there must be a story here, but I was frustrated because there just never seemed to be enough to get a handle on. We knew a lot about John Mullan, the road builder, but I could find virtually nothing about the other John Mullan, the rest of him. Well, in 2007, I'd been gathering those pieces of paper about John Mullan for a little over 2 decades. I knew of places where pieces of the story were held. I knew of the wonderful work that the Mineral County Historical Society has been doing since the 1980s to gather information to preserve the story of the road. But again, it just didn't seem like there was enough here to pull together a true biography. Well, back to that winter night in 2007 when my obsession began. I went to the computer and I got on a website called WorldCat, which is a fascinating site if you've not seen it. The world's largest library catalog, as its banner headline proclaims, literally the world's records repository is at your fingertips. And on that winter night, I typed in John Mullan as I had in the past. But this time, something pretty remarkable immediately jumped to the top of the search. I read that Georgetown University Archives in Washington, D.C. held, quote, the John Mullan Papers, containing documents generated and collected by Mullan, 1830 to 1909, pioneer, military engineer, and attorney, best known for constructing the Mullan Road in the American West, stored in 13 archival boxes. Wow, this was my eureka moment. This is the moment my wife wishes had never happened. I immediately emailed the archivist there and got a list, a thorough list of what was in the papers. And then I started emailing every archives in the country I could think of that had any connection with Mullan or the Mullan Road or any of the dozens of fascinating who's who of 19th century America who John Mullan's path crossed. And what I was able to discover after doing research in all of those repositories is that completing the Mullan Road was just one of many interesting episodes in John Mullan's long life. John Mullan chased a dream of getting rich, literally from coast to coast. And he made it. He lived for a time in the highest echelons of high society in the nation's capital. But he ultimately died a man broken in spirit and bankrupted in finances. His was a true roller coaster of a life. But I knew none of that on that winter night in 2007 when WorldCat pointed me in the direction of an obsession. But I think we should probably pause here now because I think there's some of you who are not paying attention to the speaker because you're wondering, how in the hell did Georgetown University get the John Mullan papers? Well, here's what happened. John Mullan died in 1909 and he left to his daughter May all of his possessions, which didn't amount to much, but did amount to these boxes of papers, which May preserved. May had a vision that one day the world would come to recognize the accomplishments of her father. That was the reason she had encouraged the young Addison Howard back in the 20s and 30s to write the biography. But for whatever reason, maybe Addison wasn't interested enough, maybe May didn't make an offer, maybe it was too expensive to get to DC, I don't know. But Addison Howard made no use of those papers with the exception of the journal that John's wife, it's not really a journal, a reminiscence that John's wife wrote in 1892, which is kind of unfortunate because it has lots of truth to it, but lots of places where she's kind of over the line of the truth, I guess you would say. Well, unlike her father, May not only got rich, but also remained rich. She lived in a beautiful Georgetown home next door to, quote, that nice young couple who always have the photographers around, as she told a descendant who I interviewed a few years ago. That nice young couple's names were Jack and Jackie Kennedy. It was a very nice neighborhood indeed. The Mullans, like the Kennedys, were very Catholic, so when she died in 1962, it made perfect sense for May Mullan to leave the bulk of her $1.5 million estate to Georgetown University, a Jesuit institution. She did so, as the deed states, in honor of her father and his close relationship to a man who you all know, Father Pierre de Smet. May also left to the school her Georgetown home and all of its contents, including the papers that she had carefully preserved for all of those years. So the papers, that part of the donation, went to the Georgetown University archives where they sat. and sat. I'm convinced that the archivists at Georgetown really had no concept of the value of these papers to those of us living in the West. Finally, nearly a century after John's death and more than 4 decades after May had donated them, the papers were processed and Georgetown University Archives sent notice out to WorldCat. Well, some researchers like Dan had been in the papers before Mary and I got there, but we were the first ones to sit with that collection page by page, box by box, going through every piece of paper. I mean, you do have to be obsessed to do something like this, but you also have to remember that historians live with limited expectations about exciting lives. And that doesn't get much more exciting to a historian than to be the first person to go through a major research collection. In that excursion to the East Coast, we not only stopped by several days at Georgetown, we spent several days at the National Archives. We spent time at the Smithsonian Institution, where you can find John Mullan's rather cantankerous letters dealing with various aspects of the scientists who were on his expedition. We talked to Mullan relatives. We spent a few days doing research in the Isaac Stevens papers at Yale. We subjected our rental car to extreme security checks so we could do research at West Point. It was all very exciting. But sometimes as historians we get too fascinated, too attached to paper. We forget to look around us because often there's no finer historical resource than a landscape. That's what makes the field trips that are always associated with this conference so valuable. There are things you can learn when you're on the ground that you just can't learn from a piece of paper. And that experience struck me when Mary and I spent a fine day in Annapolis, John's hometown. We'd made arrangements for the city historian to meet us and to guide us around the ancient part of Annapolis as John would have seen it. And she did a fine job. It was a great day. The Mullan home no longer exists, but she was very eager to show us where it was. It was a modest home where the large family, Mullan family, lived in very cramped quarters. But it was here, walking around that neighborhood, where a revelation struck me that's been key to me understanding John Mullan. Surrounding the small Mullan home are 3 huge mansions. One was built by a signer of the Declaration of Independence. One served as Thomas Jefferson's inspiration for Monticello. The juxtaposition between these stately homes, some of the finest houses in America, and the Mullan's own modest house could not be stronger. It was the Mullan's house was located on a street that John's father once complained during rain is flooded with filth of all kind. Well, that juxtaposition just really could not have been more stark. And it was while walking along those streets that it struck me that Mullan's lifelong aspiration to get rich, to be like his neighbors, sometimes skirting ethical and legal barriers to do so, began right here. Building a road in the West was not his end game. It was instead a way of building a reputation so that he could gain both fame and fortune. When Mullan completed his road, he received a promotion to captain, and he went to Washington, D.C. to complete his road report for the Army. Much to the consternation of his superior officers, as he often did, he became very involved in politics in Washington, D.C. in that interesting winter of 1862-63. In the Abraham Lincoln papers, which Dan helped me go through because I'd missed some things there the first time through, in the Abraham Lincoln papers, the presidential papers at the National Archives, you can find a letter that John Mullan wrote to President Lincoln on March 4th, 1863, the day that Lincoln signed the act creating Idaho Territory, asking to be appointed governor of Idaho Territory. Idaho, which at that point included all of Montana and virtually all of Wyoming, and I want you to know we're working now to get that property back. Idaho, as we heard today, was born of the Civil War. For a variety of reasons, Congress, the 37th Congress, knew when it came into session that year that it was going to form a new territory in the West. But Congress was a little bit busy with the war and really didn't have much time to think about what the boundaries of that territory would look like. So the chair of the House Committee on Territories, James Ashley, who we heard a lot about today, Ask John Mullan, a man who knew this area better than anyone in D.C. that winter. No voting member of Congress had ever been here, had no clue about the land that they were talking about. Ask John Mullan to draw a map of what the Western Territory should look like. PowerPoint 2. This is John Mullan's map, and you can see one of the things that's, and I won't get into this too much because it's kind of complicated. Congress at this time really wanted rectangular-shaped territories and states. And if you look at a map of the West, if you throw out the two anomalies of Texas and California, which came into the Union kind of different than every place else, you're going to see a bunch of rectangles until you come to Idaho. Idaho is a very peculiarly shaped state. Mullan's map made exquisite sense. It made, as we know who live here, the natural way to travel is east-west, not north-south. Mullan included the Panhandle and west part of western Montana, including where we are today, in the territory of Washington. Everything to the south and to the east, he lumped into a new territory that from the very first, his first map, he called Montana. It was only later that the name Idaho came. He had every reason to believe that Congress would pass his vision of the West. And on February 12, 1863, the United States House of Representatives easily passed the bill that included Mullan's vision for the West. It's important to recognize that. One house of the United States Congress passed a bill that would have given us a complete different look for the West. But unbeknownst to John Mullan, Washington Territory's non-voting delegate to Congress, William Wallace, was quietly working with the Senate on quite a different look for the West. In Wallace's map, the eastern border of Washington is exactly where it is today. And Wallace, in a surprise move, introduced his bill into the Senate on the last day of the 37th Congress, March 3rd, 1863. If Congress was going to act, and these days I have to say Congress actually adjourned, but anyhow, if Congress was going to act to get a new territory in the West, it would have to act before midnight on March 3rd. In a nutshell, the House of Representatives caved to the Senate. To me, as the Idaho State historian, it's a little different story for people in Montana. It was the most critical decision ever made in Idaho history, and I don't have any qualms about saying that. It established geographical, political, and cultural barriers in Idaho that made no sense and that we have been trying to struggle with for 150 years. In 1864, Congress came back and carved even more deeply into Idaho to create Montana, leaving Idaho with that isolated and awkward-looking panhandle, which has literally been a difficult nut to crack for Idaho for 150 years. Well, despite the fact that, in my opinion, the West would have been much better served if Mullan had won the battle of the dueling maps, the fact is he'd been completely outmaneuvered by William Wallace. And William Wallace also wanted to be governor of the territory. Lincoln ignored Mullan's request, despite the incredible number of members of Congress who supported Mullan's request to be territorial governor, and instead appointed William Wallace. Mullan promptly resigned from the Army, and historians have speculated about why he did so, at a time when West Point graduates were in much demand and getting rapid promotions during the Civil War. Most have concluded that Mullan was conflicted about the Civil War, having been born in Virginia and raised in Maryland. But Mullan considered his Army buddies who resigned from the Army to serve in the Confederate forces to be traitors. And he called secession a fraud which will sink its perpetrators and its abettors into eternal infamy. Other historians have speculated that John Mullan was upset because he'd been snubbed by President Lincoln. But the Mullan papers at Georgetown show a different story. We don't have to speculate any longer. Mary and I were opening files late in an afternoon after a long day of trying to decipher John Mullan's penmanship. He had to pass a penmanship class at West Point to get out of there. How he did it, I don't know. But we chanced across a fragile diary written in a very different hand, that of a young woman very much in love. To my knowledge, a diary that had only been seen by 3 people, the woman who wrote it, her daughter, and the archivist who processed the papers. It was the 1859 diary of Rebecca Williamson of Baltimore, 4 years later to become Rebecca Mullan, a diary written as if addressed to her future husband, but one that she didn't ever intend to show to him, and I'm sure would have been embarrassed if he had seen. When John left Baltimore in 1859 to come out and once again start his road project, Rebecca started writing her diary and immediately mourned his absence. When you parted, my best beloved friend, you can form but a slight idea of the emotion that stirred my very soul. And in this diary, Rebecca envisioned their future together, and it is apparent that she had reservations about a decision that John had already made to leave the Army once he had completed his road. This is a phrase that Army recruiters probably don't want to hear, but she said, in the Army, you can always maintain your position as a gentleman, and you have leisure to devote to those pursuits from which you derive so much pleasure. So stay in the Army. It's a good deal. You can do whatever you want, but we have a steady income. As early as 1859, John had revealed to Rebecca that at the appropriate time, with his reputation as a road builder firmly in hand, he would resign from the Army and pursue the financial standing that he had always coveted. His resignation from the Army had nothing to do with Confederate sympathies or with presidential snubs. He just wanted to get rich. The opportunity to resign and hopefully get rich came in the spring of 1863 when a group of capitalists encouraged John Mullan to return to Walla Walla as a civilian to head up a venture to build a short-line railroad from the Columbia River to the beginning of his road in Walla Walla. It seemed the opportunity that John Mullan had long sought, but his life almost immediately began to spin out of control. John was never able to convince enough investors of the merits of the railroad to make it a success, and the effort rather quickly failed. Still, it hadn't taken much convincing to get John back to Walla Walla. He had purchased business property in town before he left in 1862 after completing his road. He fully intended to return and grow rich with the city that was booming because of his road. For 2 decades, Walla Walla was the biggest and most prosperous city in Washington Territory because of its location on the Mullan Road. So while we talk about whether or not the Mullan Road was a success, if you were a business person in Walla Walla between 1862 and the mid-1880s, you had no question that this was a successful highway. John would have been willing to make a brief hiatus to Idaho to serve as territorial governor, further burnishing his reputation, but he believed that his future lay in Walla Walla. I discovered that the story of what went so wrong in Walla Walla lay not in Georgetown, but in another archives clear across the country. So the search for John Mullan now moved west. A review of court records at the Washington State Archives in Cheney quickly revealed how rapidly Mullan's dream of Walla Walla prosperity crumbled. John brought 3 younger brothers into his various business schemes, which in addition to the railroad included a farm, a stage line, a livery, and a sawmill. And though the family had seemed closely knit when living in that small Annapolis home, the potential for economic gain soon brought the relationship cutthroat competition. John soon realized that 2 of his younger brothers were scheming against him, and things became very ugly, with literally brother suing brother. John could not pay the debts that had been accumulated by his brothers. At the same time, his brother Lewis was plotting to take away the family farm, and remarkably, even though Lewis had never put a dime into the family business, he was able to take part of the farm away from John. John and Rebecca hobbled out of Walla Walla without a farm and completely bankrupt. Like so many others in American history, were seeking a fresh start, they next set their sights on California. So our trail in search of John Mullan took us next to Chico State University, where the papers of John Bidwell are housed. John Bidwell was, in the 1860s, one of California's wealthiest people, the owner of one of its largest ranches. He platted the town of Chico and gave away free city lots just so people would come to work on his huge Rancho Chico. The Bidwell Mansion is now a state museum. Well, you can see why John Mullan would be attracted to such a guy. I mean, he always coveted wealth. Leaving the Northwest in 1862 after building his road, he'd actually ridden by Rancho Chico, and he left a rather exuberant description, which is in the museum, the Bidwell Museum. When the day we were there, we asked the docents and the staff member who was there, what do you know about John Mullan? Not much. But they do have this really nice quote from him. This is only a part of it, but he says, "The center of this large estate is the beautiful village of Chico, where live an educated and contented peasantry, all more or less supported by the means of this bachelor millionaire whose residence is an architectural gem. You can just see Mullan, that's what he wanted to be. Mullan didn't meet Bidwell on that trip, but their paths crossed in 1865 when the millionaire Bidwell, who was then a member of Congress, and the bankrupt Mullan both set their eyes simultaneously on the Boise Basin, then teeming with miners needing provisioning. Both independently came to the conclusion that if they could construct a stage and freight line out of Chico, they could do very well by provisioning the miners, and for Bidwell it would serve as a place to send a lot of his produce from the huge Rancho Chico. Well, Mullan had learned his way around the Washington bureaucracy from his mentor Isaac Stevens, and he spent much time in Washington, D.C. in 1865 lobbying for a mail contract, which was almost always essential to the success of a stage and freight line, to have the government subsidy. And he was successful in getting a $75,000 mail contract for the line from Chico. Bidwell, as I mentioned, was then in Congress, was also working for a mail contract, although not in partnership with Mullan. But Bidwell, powerful and influential though he was, soon discovered something that many others learned about John Mullan. Once Mullan set his mind to something, he relentlessly pursued it. The Bidwell papers in Chico are full of the wealthy congressman's regrets about being forced into a partnership with Mullan, but also being virtually powerless to do anything about it. Mullan edged himself in continually so that I could not strike anywhere without hitting him, Bidwell wrote in exasperation. But Bidwell could not shake Mullan, and Mullan characteristically put everything into the Chico line, which now became a reluctant partnership with Bidwell. A local newspaper called Mullan an inexhaustible small steam engine. But try as he might, he could not make the road a success. Disenchanted with his forced partnership with Mullan, Bidwell never put any real money into it, and in 1866, John Mullan went bankrupt again. For the next episode in Mullan's career, we traveled south to the Bancroft Library at Berkeley and to the California Historical Society, and I supplemented this with a really neat search engine called Chronicling of America, the Library of Congress's newspaper digitization project. Just enter in a name, a person, an event, and you have instant access to hundreds of newspapers, something that was impossible for historians and something I'm convinced is going to completely change the craft of what we as historians do. In the old days, you used to go through one paper, one page at a time, or microfilm reels. Now you can get access to hundreds, and I immediately got access to dozens of papers about John Mullan. And in these California repositories and in those digitized newspapers, I discovered how it was that John Mullan rose phoenix-like from his two bankruptcies in Walla Walla and Chico. Mullan moved to San Francisco and he read law. He opened a law firm with a partner named Frederick Hyde and prospered by working the darkest corners of California land law, a young state whose loose laws were ripe for speculation. And Mullan and Hyde took full advantage, engaging in a practice that finally brought Mullan the prosperity he had always coveted, but at the risk of his carefully honed road-building reputation. California was then dispensing with thousands of acres of public land with no agency to oversee it, and California fell into free-for-all, money-grubbing chaos, basically. And Mullan and Hyde were at the center of the firestorm, becoming one of the largest land speculating firms in California, amassing dubious circumstances, probably not illegal, but ethics aside, amassing thousands of acres of public lands at ridiculously low cost that they then sold at a very good, nice profit. A clerk in the land office once referred to John as the notorious Captain John Mullan. It's not quite the sheen that we in the Northwest have of the Army lieutenant who built that splendid road. After land speculating for a few years, John Mullan moved on to what he thought would be an even more lucrative venture. He knew the law and he knew how to lobby. And for the next stage of his life in the 1870s, he set up a law office in Washington, D.C., and that's where he remained the rest of his life. It's a good thing that he quit land speculating when he did, because his former partner, Frederick Hyde, continued with the nefarious dealings that Mullan and Hyde had perfected and spent much of his time in federal prison. Mullan became a lobbyist for the states of California, Oregon, Nevada, and the Territory of Washington, and he did remarkably good work for them, and he did it ethically and legally. Indeed, he was probably too successful. For years, Mullan worked for various cases, and it gets complicated, so I won't go into it, but various reasons that the federal government owed new states money. The states were so new and the politicians so naive in many ways that they didn't even know to ask for this money until John Mullan pointed it out to them. And they said, sure, if you want to go get us some money, that's great. And he set up a fee of 20 to 25% of all that he would procure. Well, that worked really well, as long as the sums were relatively small and he kind of floated under the radar screen without anyone paying attention. But when he landed $1 million contract for California, all of a sudden his fees became what the Republican press always called outrageous fees. John Mullan was a lifetime Democrat, and he had the misfortune of landing his biggest federal payments to California at a time when Republicans were in the ascendancy. The legal case about whether or not the state should pay Mullan ground on for decades. Mullan, always thorough, never one to suffer criticism, wrote a 580-page book explaining why he was legally entitled to his fees. His case against California eventually went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and eventually Mullan was at least partially vindicated, but that happened after he died. Seeing how California had managed to bilk Mullan out of his lawful fees, Nevada and Oregon followed suit, and John Mullan never received many of the payments that were rightfully him for doing legal work that brought thousands and actually millions of dollars into western state coffers. But before California and the other states reneged on their payments, John Mullan had for a time lived the life that he had always dreamed. Do one of those digital newspaper searches of John Mullan in the 1880s, and you'll find stories about the beautiful yellow dress that Rebecca wore when the Mullans were invited by President Cleveland to his inaugural ball, about the Mullan family's extended travels to Europe, about the debutante coming out of the 2 Mullan daughters. But do a search for John Mullan 20 years later, and you'll see how far he had fallen, about how now his debutante daughters are operating a laundry, trying to piece together a living for the family. John had left the West as a notorious land grubber, and when it came time to find allies to help him defend his claims to rightful fees, John Mullan found that he had precious few. He had long lost the tarnish of his road-building reputation. Well, there have been other interesting searches, and I'm only going to mention one more because Margaret Gorski was here today. I don't think she's here tonight, but I told her I would mention this one. Margaret is the president of the National Lewis and Clark Trail Heritage Foundation, so I said I'd throw in something about Lewis and Clark. On a winter day, winter camp 1861, John Owen sent John Mullan an invitation to come give a public lecture as a fundraiser for orphans. I don't know how this worked. How many orphans were there in Montana in 1861? But nonetheless, Mullan rode out of camp on Christmas and went down to Fort Owen and gave a lecture on his heroes, Lewis and Clark. And it was the first public lecture ever given in what became the state of Montana. And remarkably, that document was saved by John Owen and now is at the Montana Historical Society in Helena. Mullan suffered a stroke in the 1890s. He grew weak as a kitten, as he wrote, but his mind remained strong. He continued to fight the states for the fees that were lawfully his, and he continued to work as an attorney, though never very lucratively. A writer for Sunset Magazine visited John in 1909. That was when that last photograph was taken, a few months before John died. Typically, that interview is full of the bragging that was so much a nature, part of John Mullan's nature, but it's also a very revealing article, perhaps the best ever written about him. His body has become enfeebled, wrote the interviewer, but his mind, still alert, went readily back the 50-odd years to the route through the wild that was his life work. Mullan's health took a sudden downturn in December 1909, and he died on December 28th. He was 79. The Sunset article, which actually appeared after his death, was his finest obituary, capturing the personality of this proud man far better than the few obituaries that ran about him, usually a paragraph or two, often jumbling his accomplishments. I have not yet found a paper in Washington, Oregon, or Idaho. Of course, a lot of our papers haven't been digitized yet, but I've yet to find a paper that made any account of his death. John had kind of been forgotten out here. That was going to change in a few years later, about 1916, when all of those monuments started going up. The few newspapers elsewhere that did write obituaries usually summarized Mullan's life, as I said, in about 2 or 3 paragraphs. Far more captivating are the stories that appear with them on those pages. An advertisement for the Royal Laundry, telephone number Madison 1959, ran above Mullan's obituary in the Richmond, Virginia paper. The page with the Mullan death announcement in the San Francisco paper carried the banner headline, "Aeroplane's flight marred by lack of suitable starting field." A man who we remember as building a wagon road through Indian country had lived to the day of telephones and human flight. Well, I honestly didn't know when I began this multi-year writing venture if there would be enough for a biography that really detailed the life, both the ups and downs of this fascinating man, a man who was a real man and not just a caricature, a person who came into a region, built a road, and then somehow just disappeared. But the pieces of the puzzle continued to fall in archives large and small, literally across the United States. And in my mind, at least, I think he's a fitting character for a biography. John Mullan was a brave man, an underappreciated leader of men, in my opinion, a significant explorer of the American West, a fine engineer, an incredibly meticulous and hard-working individual. But he was also an egotistical, unethical money grubber who went out of his way to garner publicity at the expense of others and who cottoned not one bit of criticism. But that's the nature of history. It usually is messy. Our heroes always have flaws. It's fitting that we pay respect to Mullan's accomplishments because they were considerable. But as we honor the road that we built, it's also good that we understand something about the road builder himself. John Mullan was a person with ample attributes and with many faults. He was, in that sense, like all of us, because he was, after all, the first Mullanite. Thank you very much. You've been a very kind and patient audience.